Let's please turn your Bibles to Genesis chapter 7, and where we are picking up our study in the flood of Noah. And we are doing a PowerPoint presentation today, so much of it I'm going to be looking over at the screen and trying to read. And actually, this PowerPoint presentation, and for those that are listening on tape, we'll still be posting this on tape, but you won't be getting much out of the study because you won't be able to see the animations and the slides. But if you contact us at the webpage at www.calvarypo.org and then order the DVD that we're going to be producing from this study and next week's study. This study is really going to be going through from the fountains of the great deep bursting up, causing global flood, and just looking at how did the whole world get flooded. And then next week, we're going to be looking at where did the water go? The two great questions of the flood of Noah are, as we sit here on a dry earth with almost 30,000 foot mountains and almost 30,000 foot deep ocean trenches, where did all the water come from to flood? And where did the water go? Well, we hope to answer those two questions in the next 2 weeks. Today, we're going to emphasize where did the water come from to flood the entire earth. Here we are studying a Bible considered the Word of God that Jesus even referenced the flood of Noah in his teaching to his disciples. We believe that Jesus is God incarnate. He's the Word of God. He's all-knowing, all-powerful, poured into a human body to share with us the truths of God and reveal who God is. Jesus referred to the flood of Noah as an actual fact. And so that means that if the whole world wasn't flooded, then we've got a problem with everything about our faith. We shouldn't be here wasting our time if the earth wasn't flooded. And one of my motivations, because this has been a passion of mine for 30 years of being a Christian, to understand this, because our children, when we teach them and they grow up and they go to the colleges and universities and they get fed the evolutionary geology, and they don't have an understanding of the flood of Noah, their faith can be challenged in, do I really believe this Noah account? If I have to throw out the Noah flood account, then do I have to throw out the Jesus account? Do I have to throw out the parting of the Red Sea? Is this a fable? Are my parents believing a fable? And therefore, some of this is going to be scientific today, and you're going to go, boy, Kevin, you lost me out in the parking lot. I shouldn't have come today. I'm going to just encourage you, just avoid those kind of feelings, because you should be equipped to at least know, I know somebody that has an answer for when your children question or your neighbor questions, that you can take them to something that will increase their faith, because the enemy's trying to destroy the faith. And you can, with complete biblical and scientific assurance, be totally at peace with a global flood. And one of the biggest reasons is because there are seashell fossils on the top of every single mountain on this earth. And that's just a simple fact. And so it's easy to, just by that fact, it's easy to believe there was a global flood. But how? How did it happen? The flood of Noah, it's a teaching that's based on the literal view of the Genesis account. And we're going to be emphasizing that, and have been in our study up till now. It's also flood being global, cataclysmic event. Some people have tried to twist the Genesis account to say, well, it was just a local flood where people were in Mesopotamia area. It was just where Noah and his family were. The rest of the earth didn't get flooded. It was just a local flood right there. I disagree. The Bible disagrees. Jesus disagrees. Peter disagrees. Everybody died. And not just everybody, every creeping thing. Every bird, everything with breath in its mouth died according to the biblical account. Again, if it wasn't global, the Bible is not the truth. You can't interpret it different. It says everything died. Dr. Walt Brown is the author of The Hydroplate Theory. This is a book, many of you have seen it. We've sold dozens and dozens over the years. This is Dr. Walt Brown's 7th edition of the book. The 8th edition, preliminary 8th edition, is on his website at creationscience.com, and and it will be available as soon as the 7th edition sells out. Then he's going to pull the web version off and sell the 8th edition as a hard copy. But you can go to the updated version of his Hydroplate Theory on the website. It's very updated since this book has come out, because many discoveries of comets, asteroids, etc., even asteroid discoveries just 3 weeks ago, have affected and completely going along with the hydroplate theory. For those that have never heard his bio, he was a West Point Army officer, graduated from West Point. He became an Army Ranger officer. Then he was the very first, it was the Army, for the very first time, the Army sponsored one of their officers to go get a doctorate. Walt Brown was the very first person in the history of the country's military service of the Army where the Army sent somebody to go get a doctorate, and they sent him to MIT to go get a doctorate. And MIT is arguably the most prestigious scientific higher education place in the world. And so in other words, you have to know something to get there. And Dr. Brown's credentials, scientific credentials, where he got a doctorate in mechanical engineering at MIT, qualify him to make some of the statements that he does in his book. And so he was then, the Air Force wanted his talents, his educational talents, to be at the Air Force Academy. So the Air Force pulled him out of the Army, and he retired from the Air Force as an Air Force Academy professor. And then he left the Air Force because he wanted to devote full time researching his belief of how the flood occurred. And that research has been going on now for over 20 years since he retired, and it is completely, his theory is being validated every day by the discoveries, which are all supporting predictions and other anticipations of the hydroplate theory. This is getting back to our Genesis 1-2. Laying the back, how was the earth created? For those that have been following us in Genesis, this is a quick review. In Genesis 1:2, it says the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So there was the earth had mantle, and it says that the whole world was covered. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters of the earth. At creation, the earth was solid, covered by water. That's what the Bible tells us in Genesis 1:2. And then in Genesis 1:6, it says, and God said, let there be an expanse. And that just kind of pops in there because that's what God said. He said, let there be an expanse, and this is the New American Standard Version instead of the King James, which says firmament, because it really means an expanse. And Walt Brown, for reasons we discussed in our study earlier, and you can go listen to our earlier study where we got in detail about why that expanse means the crust of the earth, a 10-mile thick crust. Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. I really completely agree with Dr. Brown looking at all of his reasoning. It's a couple, 3 pages in his book, Reasoning, of why the expanse was the crust being put in between the waters so that there was still, the earth is still covered with water, but there's now and he theorizes about 3/4 of a mile thick column of water underneath the crust. This is an animation by Eric Donovan from Colorado. I just met with him in Littleton here about 3 weeks ago, a month ago, discussing animating this. And so, again, to think of the power of God, first of all, we do believe that the power of God breathed the heavens and the earth into existence. And so here's the earth. And when God says, make an expanse and let it separate the waters from the waters, he just put an expanse between the waters. And Eric Donovan is going to further animate this and hopes to have it be on a TV special on high-definition TV, animating the entire thing, including the comet chapter of Dr. Brown's. And so, again, just reviewing the next slide, before the dry land appeared, there was water above and below a relatively solid granite crust that's sitting on top of the mantle, and actually there's a layer of basalt on the mantle, but I'm just keeping it simple here, sitting on the mantle of the earth. And then some assumptions that go along with this, the subterranean water chambers included large amounts of carbon dioxide. And so Walt only has one major assumption of his theory that explains over 20 different things on the earth today. One, and that is that there was water under the crust of the earth at one time that was all interconnected in chambers. That's what the Bible says, is there was water. So that's his main assumption. His second assumption, that's kind of a sub-assumption, is that there was large amounts of carbon dioxide and salt, and that it also consisted, the granite consisted of iron, nickel, and other heavy metals that came down. Now the salt explains why there are, on the earth today, inexplainable by evolutionary ideas of how the earth formed, there are huge, huge layers of salt. Some expanding 100,000 square miles of sedimentary salt that's been laid down, just solid salt. In fact, in our country, we're looking at digging down to those salt layers to bury our super radioactive nuclear waste. They consider it to be the most stable places in the country, and that would be a great place to stick it. There are some places where the layer of the salt thickness is 1 mile thick. And there are reasons why that would be the case with the hydroplate theory. The other, carbon dioxide, explains why there's all the limestone all over the earth. The evolutionary mind cannot explain why there's so much limestone all over the earth. It's an extreme amount of carbon required to make all the limestone. Then God said in Genesis 1:9 through 10, God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God said that it was good. So God didn't leave that expanse just there with water below and on top, where the world is still all covered with water. He said, let the dry land appear. How did that happen? Well, the granitic crust, the weight of the crust, because it is unstable, just sitting there on water, would have dropped down pillars into the mantle. It would have flowed. We have to understand that 10 miles deep, the pressure in this earth is 62,000 pounds per square inch. Rock is not rock at 62,000 pounds per square inch. It's like putty. In fact, everything is like putty. So the granite is sitting there, and there was any heavy places of the granite would have caused these like pillar-like stalactites, the stalactites you see in a cave that come down. There would have been dripping down places that hit down into the mantle, creating pillars. What Walt refers to as pillars that would have then attached to the mantle of the earth. And when it did that, when it dropped down, then those places of the crust would drop down, creating an area for oceans to run into, and all of a sudden oceans would have formed and the land would have appeared. So, after the dry land appeared, you have pre-flood seas that are over areas where the crust is dipped down and touching the mantle. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. So there's now trapped underneath the crust of the earth, large, half of the volume of our oceans, theorized by Walt, half of the current volume of our oceans trapped underneath the crust of the earth, and the other half on top of the pre-flood earth, meaning that there was large amounts of land, littler amounts of oceans, not as high mountains. There weren't 20,000-foot mountains. There weren't even 10,000-foot mountains before the flood. There were, in fact, the theory, and there's other issues here that you can get from the book, but the theory is the highest mountain was about 5,000 feet. And the deepest ocean was about 5,000 feet. And that was the pre-flood condition. And then a cross-section that comes out of Walt's book is the pre-flood earth, which had shallow seas where the pillars of the earth's crust touched the mantle, and there's a pillar-like structure, rolling hills and low elevation mountains, and large amounts of water, carbon dioxide underneath the crust. And and his slide actually shows the mantle. Above the mantle is a layer of basalt, which is kind of not important for our discussion here today. So that's the pre-flood earth based on an understanding of the book of Genesis, and this understanding lends itself to understanding the flood of Noah. And since the flood of Noah occurred, it has to have occurred, then this lends itself. In fact, I've also should mention, there are other theories of how it occurred. In every case, the ones that I've looked at, and I've looked at everything that I know that's out there, in every case the other theories are unbiblical, which means they can't be true. And not only that, in all those cases they're unscientific, and if they're unbiblical and unscientific, chances are they didn't happen, and none of the evidence of the earth supports it. One of them is that a comet crashed into the earth providing all the water to flood the earth. That doesn't explain, it doesn't explain 20-some things of the earth. It also doesn't explain where did the water go. And if it just crashed to the earth and provided water as a big, huge water source, where did the water go? Et cetera, et cetera. So this one will answer where it came from and where it went. So are there verses that support this understanding? Yes. It says in Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein. For he founded the world, the earth, he founded the earth upon the seas and established it upon the waters. Now, I've read very, very astute Bible commentators, very, very prolific in Greek and Hebrew, and they're trying to explain verses like this and the other ones that we're going to go through. We think they got it wrong. The earth isn't on the waters. The waters are on the earth. They have trouble with these verses. But you don't have trouble if you believe that Genesis 1 was saying what it's saying. He founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. The earth is established on waters. By the word of the Lord, the heavens were made, Psalm 33:6. And all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. And so this is talking early creation. He made the heavens, the hosts by the breath of his mouth. He gathers the waters of the sea together as a heap. He lays up the deep in storehouses. He laid up deep storehouses of water under the earth. It says in Psalm 104, you cover yourself with light as with a garment, who stretch out the heavens like a curtain. Again, the creation day, stretching out the heavens, making it like a curtain. He lays the beams of his upper chambers in the waters, who makes the clouds his chariot, who walks on the wings of the wind. To him, Psalm 136, to him by wisdom made the heavens, for his mercy endures forever. To him who laid out the earth above the waters. People go, laid out the earth above the waters. We don't understand that. Well, you can if you think that he's talking about the crust of the earth being laid out above the waters. And then this is out of Peter. This is a verse from Peter where it says, for this they willfully forget, the non-believers of the last days, this is talking about now, they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old. God created the heavens and the earth, standing out of water and in the water. So the earth the pre-flood earth was standing out of the water. There was dry land, but the pre-flood earth was also standing in the water. Standing in the water with pillars sticking down through waters trapped underneath the crust prior to the flood, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. So Peter is saying the land was out of the water, land was in the water, and that water came out to flood the earth, is really what is being said in 2 Peter. So going back to New American Standard, verse 1:9 through 10, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And the next, just this next animation, just before we started here, I just want to say this again is the crust has been placed between the two waters, and now it's been animated by Eric to show the fact that the crust would flow. And it's hard to imagine rock flowing, but again, it's hard to imagine 60,000 pounds per square inch. And the unbalance is there, so the rock would have flowed, dropping pillars down onto the mantle, creating areas for the water to go into to let the dry land appear. And we'll just take in this animation. And so I asked him to slow it down so that in the discussion, and this would have created a tremendous amount of heat actually while it's doing this, and there would have been melting of metals. There would have been melting of everything in the granitic crust. The lowest melting thing is the quartz in the crust, and it would have melted out. Iron and nickel would have melted out, concentrated at the pillars, and these pillars would have been hot. The next one is a side view of a cubic, kind of looking at a cube of the earth, also showing the pillars going down, the dry land appearing, and the seas appearing as the pillars drop down. Again, this is theory, but it goes along with what the Bible says, and it also goes along with how the flood could have occurred. And so the pillars are dropping down through the water, the dry land appears, and it's very possible that the earth the Earth before the flood, we see all kinds of huge flora, huge dinosaurs, huge oysters, clams. The Earth had this incredible amount of vegetation prior to the flood. We know that from many different ways, we can look at through the fossil record. Because the mountains were much lower, the winds would have been different, the weather would have been different, the entire Earth would have been much more watered. And we also have from Genesis that the ground was just misting up and watering. And so there was a tremendous amount of vegetation on the Earth in a condition of shallow seas and not so high mountains. An additional assumption, and this isn't really an assumption, this is more of a fact. This is a fact. If this is the way the Earth really was, if the theory is correct, then what would have happened is all the waters that are trapped underneath the crust, but all interconnected because these pillars wouldn't have kept one side of the Earth's water from moving over to the other side of the Earth. It is a fact that since the moon was created on the fourth day, the lunar effect of the moon upon the Earth would have created tides, a tidal effect on that subterranean water. In other words, when the moon was close to the near side of the Earth, it would be trying to pull the water from the back side of the subterranean chambers to the front side and would have lifted, and I'm going to say 15 inches. There's a reason for saying 15 inches. It would have lifted the near side crust 15 inches, dropped it back down, lifted it, dropped it back down twice a day. Because that's how many times we experience a tide now. The average tide of the Earth today is 30 inches, while it was 15 inches back then. Now, when you lift a 10-mile crust 15 inches and let it back down, you're talking billions of pounds of mass moving and going back, and work, the definition in physics world, work is equal to force through a distance. And it's 15 inches is not much distance, 10 miles of crust is a lot of force. And that work created heat. So the other part of the theory that's recently come together for Dr. Brown is not part of the 7th edition book, is that this thermal condition of heating up the water and heating up the pillars as they would have been bouncing off of the mantle as this lunar effect was occurring, was adding so much heat to that water that the temperature and pressure of this water is greatly increasing over the 1,600 plus years between creation and the flood. And so while everybody's willy-nilly up on topside, getting evil, as it turns out, to the days of Noah, down deep underneath them, this tidal effect is adding temperature and pressure, which is about to become their judgment. And so it's a very important assumption, and again, it's a fact that if there was water, it would be heating up. There would be a tremendous amount of heat being added to that subterranean water. So now we have to get a little bit really scientific here. But there's going to be some benefit for those moms that have always wondered why a pressure cooker works better. So there's supercritical temperature water. Dr. Brown theorizes this temperature increase to the water getting above 705 degrees, which is called supercritical. Water has a saturated temperature and pressure relationship between freezing and 705 degrees. And here's a water. This is actually right to this level is a pint, which I'm going to tell you, supercritical water, this is worth a half a stick of dynamite in energy, is where we're going with this. But if I wanted to boil this water, how hot do I have to get it? Anybody here, any of you science experts here? 212. At atmospheric pressure at sea level, 212 degrees. So as soon as I heat this water up at 212 degrees, it starts boiling because there's 14.7 pounds absolute pressure at atmospheric pressure at sea level, which we're at, that the pressure's trying to keep it from boiling. That's here, we don't feel it because it's all around us. And at 212, it'll start boiling. Well, years ago, just because of people knowing the effects of water, is they invented pressure cookers. This happens to be Juanita's and ours. And no matter how much, this is the thing for kids, I want to cook this thing, I want to boil this egg a lot faster by turning the heat up. You're not heating up that egg any faster. No matter how much it's boiling, it's still only 212 degrees. So what you have to do is to make that water boil hotter is you have to pressurize the water. And this is what pressure cookers are. And they make this lid. They make the lid so that it actually goes inside and like this because it's made to pressurize 10, 15 pounds. If pressure's increased at 10 pounds, it'll boil it at 240 degrees. And if you have a 15-pound pressure cooker, it'll boil at 250 degrees. That's why if you boil a chicken in a pressure cooker, it can get done a lot quicker because it's getting hotter, the water's hotter inside. If there were a way to increase the pressure, like for this one, there's a little weight that goes on there. If I press it down, I could increase the pressure to the point where the pan could blow up. If you have one of those glass pots, if you were to push down the lid tightly when it's boiling, you would see the boiling stop because you're putting just a little bit of pressure. You would stop the boiling until the water heated up to the new pressure boiling point, and then it would start boiling again. And if you pushed it down and got it to stop boiling and then it starts boiling again, you lifted the lid off, it would explode in boiling because it's instantly got to all explode in boiling to get down to that temperature of atmospheric pressure again. But you don't want to do that because it would actually erupt violently enough to possibly scald you. So again, don't do that at home. But now this pressure temperature relationship continues all the way up to 705 degrees. That's where water does something incredible. A recent discovery about this critical point of water is actually helping to clean up extreme chemical waste because critical point of water has properties that are being used to disassemble chemical waste. But all the way up to 705 degrees, if you could see in the container that could hold the pressure, and it's like 3,200 pounds at 705 degrees, so it wouldn't be a glass container, but if you could look through it, you would see a water layer and you would see a steam layer. You would see the vapor, water vapor, and you would see the liquid side. As soon as you get to a little over 705 degrees, the critical point of water, you no longer see liquid water. The line between liquid water and vapor disappears. And all that there are is microscopic globules of liquid water, 10 to 20, at certain pressures just above critical point, 10, 20 molecules of liquid water surrounded by all the the water vapor. The properties of that, so it actually would look like mush. It looks like water mush. But the issue is if you drop the pressure on that critical water, it explodes with an energy that completely unleashes the remaining thermal energies as far as creating steam. So now it'll expand 5,000 times. So in other words, if this was critical, this much water, at critical temperature, if I then, and the steel vessel would have to be an inch thick to hold it if it was steel, and if I could somehow break that vessel, this amount of water would expand 5,000 times in volume, which is what an explosion does. And that much water is worth a half a stick of dynamite. This is half a stick of dynamite. So what does this mean? That means that if 2 pounds of water, a quart, is equal to 1 stick of dynamite. This is a pint, so it's only a half a stick of dynamite. And what does that mean? That means if this water heated up to over supercritical, and there's reasons to believe it went over 850 degrees, then if a crack in the earth occurred, and that water has a way of escaping to atmospheric pressure, the amount of energy released is equivalent to billions of hydrogen bombs of energy. We cannot fathom the amount of energy that's contained in half of the volume of our oceans being heated up to supercritical water temperature 10 miles below the crust, and the crust breaks, and the amount of energy that is coming up, it has the power, and again, Walt Brown, mechanical engineering, physics, MIT degree, you can work the calculations of the amount of energy. Is it big enough to launch rocks and debris into space? Yes. What would happen if you launched rocks and debris into space along with water? They would become comets. They would become asteroids. They would be out there, and that's why they're containing minerals from Earth that were super hot at one time. It explains so much of what they're finding out. The energy is there to do it. So the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in Genesis 6:5, and God said to Noah, The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and outside with pitch. God knew this was happening. He knew the wickedness of man was coming. There is a good argument against this theory. It is a theory that would basically, well, sooner or later, the crust would have to break, even if man hadn't sinned. Well, I don't care what kind of flood scenario you put together, there was something going on to flood the whole earth, and God just knew. He knew what was going to happen. There was something about the sin of man that he triggered the break of the crust one day. The boat is big enough to fit inside of a full-size football stadium. You know, from front row seat to front row seat is how big it was, and it had 3 levels. And it was enough to put in all the kinds of, it was enough room for all the animals to go into. No windows to see out of, because they're not going to want to see what's coming down. In other words, this had to be a heavy-duty boat to endure what the world was about to see. And he shut Noah in with the animals. People ask, I want to just make this one point. People say, how did all the animals, how did he round them all up? Well, it's a fact that in the Sumatra quake of Christmas time, 2 Christmases ago, people were in shock that these elephants in Thailand that were, in Banda Aceh and these other places, they just ripped out their chain pegs out of the ground and they head for high ground. They're widely reported in the news media. Why did all these animals start heading for the hills? Because God told him. I mean, that wave is still way out there. The wave before it comes into the land is only a couple inches thick, a couple inches high above the normal. They're not going to feel anything different. They're not going to, the earthquake has already occurred. They felt the earthquake. The tsunami came to Thailand much later. God said, get out of Dodge. I'm dealing with humans on this one. And what did he do in Noah's day? I mean, the Bible doesn't say, except that all the animals went there. Our God told those animals, go get in the ark with Noah. Then he unleashed the power reserved in the subterranean waters when, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month and the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up. Now, if you don't understand that there's water underneath the crust, what does the Bible mean when it says all the fountains of the great deep burst up in one day? And the windows of heaven were open and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Global rainfall. Now people say, well, Kevin, you've just convinced me this 800-degree water under the crust is coming blasting out of this crack that would have scalded everybody. No. Because when the water, the liquid part of the supercritical and those globules of molecules of liquid water exploded themselves into steam, expanding the volume 5,000 times, and then going many more times by depressurizing the atmosphere, it would have cooled off. Because you depressurize any gas, it cools off. And not only was it cooling off because of that, but some of it says the windows of heaven were open. This fountain, launching from the crust of the earth, which Walt's done the calcs, if you're 1,000 miles away from the crack, you could survive if you have a boat. And there was only one guy with a boat that was built for it, him and his family. So everything within 1,000 miles is basically dead in the shock wave. And so everything 1,000 miles away would have originally been able to try and live with the downfalling rain. This would have created a global rainfall. The center of the fountain would have been jettisoning stuff into space. The sides of the fountain, because not as much velocity, ripping up the ends of the crust, sending sediments all over the world, burying billions of plants and animals all over the earth that are creating the fossil record all over the earth. The energy destroying the sides of the crust and eroding it would have then created just rainfall all over the earth for 40 days. But the stuff that's going up straight, it's heading to space, some of it had enough energy to keep going, to leave Earth's gravitational field and to go into orbits around the sun. But some of it would have gone up, not had quite enough energy, fallen back down as dry ice, because there was carbon dioxide in the subterranean chamber. Some of it would have come down as dry ice. Some of it would have come down as just regular, dry ice being frozen carbon dioxide, and some of it coming down as just regular hailstones, only much smaller. And I've talked to some people, oh, you know, the mammoths, because the mammoths were buried by this. The mammoths would have died in the hailstorm. It would have ripped their flesh apart. No, it wouldn't have. When stuff falls through the atmosphere, if you fall from a tall building, you're hitting the ground about as far as you jump out of a plane because of what's called terminal velocity. You only get going so fast when you're falling down through air. So this stuff would have come down, and it would have been a global rainfall in a way that's unfathomable for us to imagine. The waters and carbon dioxide of the great deep erupted with such force that much of it reached space, froze, returned to freeze, and bury living animals, which, the most famous of which is the and I don't know if I'm saying this right, Berezka mammoth, woolly mammoth. This is the most famous mammoth because over the years, the summers are melting more and more and more of the dirty ice, and all of a sudden they saw the head. 1900, they come back the next year, they dig down the rest of the remaining dirty ice to get him out, and now he's on display in a Russian museum. As far as I know, 10 out of 10, 100 out of 100, 1,000 out of 1,000 elephants die and fall down, if they can. This guy died, and he didn't fall down. Why did he not fall down? And was it only that he didn't fall down? This guy was found in the upright position just like this. They reenacted the exact position that he was found. And at first they found him, and his head was chewed up by dogs. They had eaten his head, a good chunk of his head, and it's been refashioned here. Then the winter came, froze again, but they knew where he was, so they planned the expedition to carefully go dig him out next year. So the next summer, they carefully dug him out of very dirty, with extremely fine pulverized dirt, encased in ice, dug it down and unveiled this elephant. What else was wrong with him? His back legs, you can't really see it in this picture, but his back legs are crushed, are moved forward. It's like he's trying to get up this hill, probably with flowing rain, the effects of flowing rainfall, and he's trying to get heavy ground, and all of a sudden he's slipping back and his legs fall out from behind him and go forward. But he was raised on his front legs, looking like he was grappling. Several ribs, a shoulder blade, and his pelvis were broken. Now, without any, exterior blows from, caveman stone club, how did his ribs, shoulder blade, and pelvis get broken? And more amazing than that, his front leg there, the long bone of his front leg, was crushed into a dozen different pieces without noticeable damage to the surrounding tissue. And they can tell by his flattened male anatomy and erected male anatomy that he suffocated. It's a fact indisputable by those that have studied this guy, suffocated. Now, this is a fact, this is what they found. Now, what can explain that? And this is again up in the Arctic Circle area of Siberia. You're Joe Elephant and everything's wonderful. You're chewing food. By the way, the food was still in his mouth and in his stomach, undigested. Food that does not eat, some of which does not even grow up in the Arctic Circle today. And so this guy is just tooling along and goes, wow. All of a sudden, rain comes pouring down. And he's finding, boy, I better get to high ground. And he's getting to high ground. And all of a sudden, and this is the theorized portion, that rain that went up into space, and there would have been certain areas where pulses of rain went up into space, cooled off, came back as dry ice and frozen rain and super cold rain mixed with the water, and all of a sudden it hits whatever's flowing water and freezes it. And so he's walking along, and all of a sudden he's getting frozen, and it's dirty water. In his lungs was dirty water. So he's trying to breathe through it, and he's suffocating from the carbon dioxide that's still coming off from freezing the water, and all of a sudden he's frozen in his tracks, and he can't move. And it keeps coming and keeps coming and keeps coming and burying this guy, crushing his leg that cannot move. And by the way, his leg had to have been straight while it was crushing, because you can't crush a beam. You can't, once you break a beam, you can't then continue to crush it 12 different times. So in other words, it was in a place and crush, 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 crush. Later on, as the flood continued, the fountains are erupting, other dirt and other sediments could have gone on top of him, as we see the sediment layer, and then the water on top. The Sumatra quake of December 2004, the mass change in the ocean floor over here caused the earth to roll, not change its axis, but the earth rolled 2 centimeters. It's a fact of physics. So, let's say you're Joe Mammoth, Mastodon, eating, in Central America. And all of a sudden, you get buried, planted by this ice, crushed, killed, where you're standing eating vegetation of Central America. And then the compression event that we're going to talk about next week occurs, rearranging the mass on the surface of the earth. And now all of a sudden, the earth rolls, and North America is now part of the North Pole area, the Arctic Circle area. Everybody, all the other mammoths, and by the way, rhinoceroses have also been found in the Arctic Circle, frozen to death. They've been found down in Antarctica, down below the ice sheets in Antarctica, frozen to death. My brother even said he saw, they were pulling out, when he was stationed in Antarctica, he told me that he saw that they found a saber-toothed tiger underneath the ice in Antarctica. It's, again, without dispute, it's a fact that they found these things that cannot live in those places now. So then what happens is the earth rolls, every place that thaws out, when the flood is over, well, their flesh decays away, they die, they're dead, their flesh decays away, they're just bones, they're gone. But what God did is he preserved these frozen mammoths that we're walking around America, let's say. Now they're up at the Arctic Circle, thousands of years later, to be found by us, as a testimony to the reality of the flood for those that want to believe it. The other theories they teach about mammoths in colleges cannot explain why a mammoth would be in that position standing up, why its bones are broken, why it has food still undigested in its stomach. Just the heat of a mammoth body would digest its stomach contents within a few hours. But if it's surrounded by very cold, coming from space water, it would cool that body off and preserve it for the next 1,000 years. People who argue against Dr. Brown's theory say that the frozen mammoths are all after the flood of Noah. They'll say, if it was frozen in ice, the ice would float, ice floats. Well, ice floats if ice is ice. This is dirty ice. And it could have had other sediments on top. So during the flood, this ice could have been down on bedrock, this dirty ice, sunk with the mammoths, down in dirty ice, and stayed there while the floodwaters were over the whole surface. And then you say, well, the waters would have melted all the ice. Wouldn't have melted, didn't melt all the ice because it's there. It's hard to argue against the fact that the thing died standing up, and it just wouldn't happen during any natural storm post-flood. This was a major cataclysmic, otherwise unexplainable event for this mammoth. So, as we discussed, he was in a southern latitude at the time because Dr. Brown theorizes that the original North Pole was about right here in Asia, and so the Earth was like this, which means that the mammoths were in a latitude that would have allowed them to live, and then the Earth rolled and put them into a latitude that kept them frozen over the years. And so over the years, as the Ice Age has gone away consistently, and Dr. Brown says, I am wrong in my theory. If you ever find a frozen mammoth, especially the standing up ones, which there aren't that many, but there's this one, if there were fossils directly underneath them, then it would obviously be after the flood. Now people will say, well, there was fossils in the area of these mammoths. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're in the area because they could have been in the sedimentary layer washed in as the floodwaters were going all over, and then when the ice is melting, they could have been in the area. The issue is they have to be directly below frozen mammoths for his theory to be wrong. The waters and carbon dioxide of the great deep erupted with such force that much of it reached space, froze, returned to freeze, and bury living animals. They've also found, to make road construction, they found fish frozen in a river in the act of swimming. This stuff falls down from space and flash freezes a small stream with fish in it, and they're frozen in the act of swimming. 50 wild oxen were found in a herd run. They're running along, and they just saw these heads of the herd of these oxen, and they start digging down, and they find out that they all died standing up, running in a herd. As the water escapes, As the water escapes below the crust, the pillars would have been breaking off, been going out with the water towards the crack, and comets would have been formed. What it says in Job is he removes the mountains, and they do not know when he overturns them in his anger. He shakes the earth out of its place, and its pillars tremble. You know, the earth would have been shaking out of its place and rolling. By the way, the Bible says in the last days the earth is going to roll again, that it's going to reel like a top and be like a drunkard, and we're going to see that crustal changes are going to be coming in the future. The escaping supercritical water contained enough energy to launch comets and asteroids into space, as we've been mentioning. And I know that's hard to fathom, but it's just physics. You got enough energy to do it, it launches, it's there, and then it's going to do its thing. Billions of tons of crust are being eroded and deposited as sediments bearing trees, plants, and animals globally. Look at that guy. He got buried before he finished lunch. And this is a real-life fossil. This isn't, and this other guy had just eaten lunch. Not even done eating the fish. Boom, he's being buried. And by the way, fossils only occur when something is rapidly buried and compressed and the oxygen's gone. That's the only way. And it's global, and it's massive. And the erosion of the crack would have caused it to occur. Here's a tree, still planted. Would have been in an area where the shock wave didn't knock it down, so it's far enough away from the crack of the crust that it's still standing straight up, not like Mount St. Helens that blew over all those trees. And so it's still standing up. And the evolutionists, if you didn't have the tree there, the evolutionists would look at all the layers of strata that are in this picture and go, oh yeah, billions of years or millions of years of strata. Well, that's quite a tree that can grow for millions of years up through all the strata. And those are found all over the world. The evolutionary geology fairy tale is just that. It's a lie. And it's something that our children have to be equipped with. And how are they equipped? By knowing how the flood of Noah occurred. And say, that's garbage. And you can go to your professors and point these things out. And the continental slope would have been formed as the waters were jettisoning out, eroding the continental slope. Every continent that's located to where the crack was would have created slopes and continental shelves. Chapter 7, verse 17 of Genesis, now the flood, the global rainfall was on the earth 40 days, but the fountains lost power as the crust is crushing down. The fountain is losing power, plus it's going through more water, and the crack is widening. But the Bible says that the waters continue to prevail on the earth for until a total of 150 days. So we have to get into our mind, it wasn't just 40 days and 40 nights of rain. It was 40 days and 40 nights where it rained all over the earth. Then it stopped raining all over the earth, but the waters continued to go up until a total of 150 days, the water increase stopped. So what was the condition at that 150 days? The average sedimentary thickness on the earth is 1 mile. The average thickness of sediment on the earth is 1 mile. Eroded from this, what used to be just a narrow crack is now an eroded crack of a total of 800 miles by theory. There's still a little bit of water underneath the crust, and we'll see the importance of that next week. But the crust has been eroded. This crust is pushing down on the mantle here with much greater force than the water is pushing down there, which is going to cause the mantle to pop up into this crack, creating the mid-oceanic ridge. This is the condition, and Noah's boat's floating right here, and it says that, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered, because they weren't that high in the first place. And actually, the high hills in the first place were the weak areas or the not thick areas of the crust that had bowed up, but now the heavy parts of the crust have been broken, the pillars have been broken, which would have pushed those up. So in other words, the pre-flood 5,000-foot mountains would have gone back down. The earth would have been basically nearly flat. And if you have a nearly flat earth, it's easy to flood it. And the waters prevailed 15 cubits, which is 22.5 feet above the highest mountain. Bible says, unless you're over 23 feet high, you don't have any place, everything's dead. You have no place to go. And for 150 days, the waters increased and lifted, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died. Now, there's people that say, well, it doesn't really mean all died. I don't know, how much more does God have to say that everything, all the things that creep, everything that has breath, they all died. It was not a local flood, according to the Bible. And as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be also in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. The future judgment is coming, as the next verse says. Did not know until the flood came and took them. These are Jesus saying, destroyed them all. Did not know the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. He destroyed all living things. Only Noah remained alive and his family. And in 2 Peter 2:5, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people. Noah was one of 8 people didn't die in the flood. A preacher of righteousness bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. And then 2 Peter 3:7 says, but the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are preserved for fire until the day of judgment and the perdition of ungodly men. God says that I flooded it once with water, and now I'm ready to judge it with fire in the last days. Well, we're going to learn that there is tremendous energy once again trapped down deep in this earth, and it's because of the effects of this crustal rearrangement that created huge magma piles and stuff we see in little ways with volcanoes. But there's tremendous energy still left under there, and there's incredible cataclysms coming as a result of the unbalances created in the flood, and they're waiting for the day that God says, enough. And then Peter says it comes in the way of fire to judge the inhabitants of the earth. So then here's the question for everybody here. Are you on the ark, which is, in this case, Jesus? In Noah's day, it was a boat. Today, it's Jesus. And are you going to be saved from the wrath that is going to come? And the answer can only be yes, if Jesus is your Lord and Savior. And I know that this is, today it's been, a lot of things in support of what the Scripture teaches, but there's a proverb that says it's the glory of God to conceal a matter and the glory of a king to try and understand it. And God he just simply tells us in a few verses, I flooded the earth and then the waters went away. And it's been the glory of some people who have been given the gift by God to unlock, I believe, the secrets of how it happened, that for me, what it does for me, it gives me an awesome, awesome appreciation for the power of God. The truth of His Scripture, the absolute trust that we can have in Him, to know that the world is lying to us about all their other stuff. They can't even explain the fossil record, really. If they would just believe the Bible and then investigate, they would sit there and realize, we better be submitted to this God who can just breathe the earth into existence, have water under the crust, and one day it breaks, and He saves 8 people. That's, to me, the miracle is not that the flood occurred. The miracle is that 8 people survived. That's the miracle. The other miracle is that it's not that He created us. The miracle is He sent Jesus to forgive us, even though that we've sinned against Him. Let's turn quickly to Genesis chapter 7, and our study is actually in 8, but what we're going to do for those that missed, we're going to do a summary by showing a video clip here in a minute that was actually part of a CBS special in 1993. I believe it was 1993. CBS ran a special on Search of Noah's Ark, and their researchers, in preparation for that special, asked, is there a theory out there that explains how the flood of Noah could occur? And this is back in 1993. Their technical people said, this Dr. Walt Brown, who had written a book called In the Beginning, Compelling Evidence for Creation and the Flood. Dr. Walt Brown's theory is a credible theory in their view, and one that we can feature in the CBS special. So what you're about to see is a little portion of the clip which is a review of what we've discussed, which is where did the water come from to flood the whole earth. If the earth was flooded, the water came from somewhere, it had to go somewhere. We've covered where the water came from, and just as a summary of our study, chapter 7, verse 11 of Genesis, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened, that there was great amounts of water under the earth. There was a cracking of the crust, per the theory, that would have looked like a fountain as the crack circumnavigated the globe, and we're going to find out today 46,000 mile long crack circumnavigated the globe, and the water underneath the crust would have looked like a huge fountain causing global rainfall. Then to verse 22, all in those whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died. So he just didn't kill the fish, because fish live in water. I'm sure a lot of fish died because of the things that were happening, but there was survival of the fish. But everything on earth that was living that wasn't in Noah's ark died, is what the Bible says. All that was on the dry land died. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. And so it rained 40 days, 40 nights, but the waters kept on going up. And at the end of 150 days, all land is covered and Noah's boat is floating. There would have been global tidal waves because of the lunar effect, unobstructed by land. There would have been those kind of things happening. And then our study today goes into chapter 8, where it says, then God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him on the ark, and God made the wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. The fountains of the great deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So God said he stopped those waters that were coming out from the great deep, and by restraining the waters coming from the great deep, it also restrained the global rainfall, and the dry land ultimately appears as you go through chapter 8. So with that, as a summary of where the water came from, underneath the crust, fountains of the great deep, covered a relatively flat earth, let's look at the video.
We can see on our planet 17 very strange features which can now be systematically explained as a result of a cataclysmic global flood whose waters erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 10 billion hydrogen bombs. This explanation shows us just how rapidly major mountains formed. It explains the coal and oil deposits, the rapid continental drift, why on the ocean floor there are huge trenches and hundreds of canyons and volcanoes. It explains the formation of the layered strata and most of the fossils, the frozen mammoths, the so-called ice ages, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. The pre-flood Earth probably had only one very large supercontinent covered with lush vegetation. There were seas and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, but perhaps 9,000 feet high. According to the hydroplate theory, the pre-flood Earth had a lot of subterranean water, about half of what is now in our oceans. This water was contained in interconnected chambers, forming a thin spherical shell, about half a mile thick, perhaps 10 miles below the Earth's surface. Increasing pressure in the subterranean water stretched the crust just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began with a microscopic crack which grew in both directions at about 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched cloth. The subterranean water was under extreme pressure because of the weight of the 10 miles of rock pressing down on it. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. All along this globe-encircling rupture, fountains of water jetted supersonically, almost 20 miles into the atmosphere. The spray from this enormous fountain produced torrential rains, such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The Bible states that all the fountains of the great deep burst open on one day, And it describes these events about 5,000 years ago, which we can now tie together scientifically. Some of the water jetting high above the cold stratosphere froze into supercooled ice crystals and produced some massive ice dumps, burying, suffocating, and instantly freezing many animals, including the frozen mammoths of Siberia and Alaska. The high-pressure fountains eroded the rock on both sides of the crack, producing huge volumes of sediments that settle out of this muddy water all over the earth. These sediments trapped and buried plants and animals, forming the fossil record. This erosion widened the rupture. Eventually, the width was so great that the compressed rock beneath the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, the hydroplates, still with lubricating water beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of about 45 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, compressed, and buckled. The portions of the hydroplate that buckled down formed ocean trenches. Those that buckled upward formed mountains. This is why the major mountain chains are parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the oceanic ridges, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated. On the continents, each bowl-shaped depression or basin was naturally left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes.
The demonstrations you have just witnessed of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity supports the biblical story of the deluge in every detail.
Again, at the time, in 1993, he was saying that it jettisoned, the pressure was there to jettison 20 miles up into the atmosphere, but since then, as we discussed, supercritical water temperature would have had the energy to actually send things deep into space and make the comets and the asteroids, as we've discussed. So if the supercritical waters of the Great Deep erupted with enough force to send rock, water, and debris into space, because this is a picture from Dr. Brown's book, and there is the energy to send the debris into space. And so if that happened, then could this be why? If you look at that moon picture, you can see when we look at the moon, there's one face always pointed towards us. The other face we never see. On this, they've taken pictures, they've sent a spacecraft up, and if you look to the right of the center of the moon picture is the backside of the moon that we never see. To the left is the part of the moon that we always see. When we look up at the moon, you see that face of the moon, those dark areas. What we now know those are huge lava flows on the face of the moon, and has given it really a smoother appearance than the backside of the moon, which is cratered. So if you look at this, you can see that the near side of the moon, what we look at, is somewhat has these blotchy areas which are not found on the other side. Huge lava flows not found on the other side. Seismic equipment that our astronauts have left on the moon that have been reactivated show all the earthquakes happen on the near side of the moon. And so the theory is, the theory has it that the Earth spit at the moon. Spit at the moon huge rocks and chunks and debris that by the time it's coming crashing in at thousands of miles an hour into the lunar surface, it would have created huge magma flows. And so when you look up as Christians, I do believe, based on this theory that I've been researching for years, all the evidence is supporting it, that when we look up and we see the face of the moon, we're watching the lava flows that occurred from the Earth. Now, the evolutionary scientists have a very difficult time explaining why the front side of the moon has been so impacted, because if it was some kind of asteroid or meteor shower that went through, any meteors heading for the moon, what are they going to hit on the near side of the moon? They're going to hit Earth. Earth is a natural shield to the near side of the moon unless the Earth spit at the moon, unless the Earth is the source of what was happening to create that difference that we see in this slide. Now, now we're going to shift to another understanding, and this is one of the most important understandings for all your children that go to an evolutionary geology class. It is a fact that all over the Earth there are layered strata. And one continent has the same layered strata as another continent in many cases. Not all cases, but in many cases the same. So so the evolutionists will say over millions of years, you know, some volcano lays down a strata, some this lays down a strata, and these strata are found all over the Earth, and there's also layering of fossils all over the Earth. So that's why they came up with this evolutionary millions and millions of years of slow laying down of sediments in animals to create the fossil record. Well, there's an alternative to that idea. So I'm emphasizing the sediment layer here. It's not to scale because the crust was 10 or more miles thick. There's still a thin layer of subterranean water underneath the crust, and the entire Earth is flooded. Now, the water is still leaking out from underneath the crust, and if you could look underneath the water, the crust would have been fluttering. There would have been a continuous earthquake going on every single plate of the Earth. Every single crustal plate on the Earth would have been having an earthquake. As the crust was fluttering, the fossils would have been laid down, density layers would have been laid down, there would have been this sedimentary layer distributed globally as it was shaking, and the sediments were piled up into these different density layers because of a phenomena called liquefaction. Dr. Brown has a chapter on liquefaction, and what he explains is this is a concrete tank that had been sitting in the ground in Japan when they had an earthquake, and it was an earthquake when there was a lot of water in the ground, and the shaking of the ground took this low density tank and moved it up and popped it right out of the ground. Shifting to another idea, how do we know this is true? In the 1950s, when we were doing extensive oceanography, mapping the ocean floor as a country, actually the whole world was getting into the idea that when he saw this ocean ridge, those arrows are pointing to a continuous ocean floor mountain. You can't see it because it's underneath the ocean, but it's this 46,000 mile long mountain range, and it's called the Mid-Oceanic Ridge. When you're talking about the portion of the ridge in the Atlantic, it's the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So you can notice that the west side of America right here is running over this ridge that was lifting up in the Pacific. And what we're going to, telling you what I'm going to be telling you is that this ridge generally coincides with where the crack was, according to Dr. Brown's theory. That the crust was sitting on the mantle, the crust broke. The crust eroded into a wide V, and the pressure imbalances caused the crust to push on the mantle, and the mantle bowed up into that crack, and as it lifted up into the crack, the continents went away from that crack and then came to a crashing halt. The first place that the ridge rose, according to Dr. Brown's theory, is right here along the Atlantic. That's where, and that would have been closer to the equator with the way the Earth was spinning at the time. And so it would have bowed up and the continents would have been moving away from that crack. And because the crack was growing all over the Earth, it was slowly lifting as the Mid-Oceanic Ridge was growing all over the Earth. It was growing in elevation as the crack was widening. When it made the big pop in the Atlantic Ocean started to come up and the continents started to move away, that would have removed the continental crust weight, which would have caused it to lift up even more, causing the continents to move further away and faster as they're moving away, causing the mantle to move up even more. And when it moves up in the Atlantic, it has to go down somewhere else, we're going to see. And so it's coming up in the Atlantic, it has to go down someplace else. That's creating a sliding effect of the continents that we will look at here in a minute. But you can see, I'm again telling you what I'm going to tell you. We'll go back and look at this. But right here, this is what made the Olympic and Cascade Mountain Range. America sitting on a hydroplate, which is like oil. It's sitting on the water. The hydroplate of America is sitting on the water still underneath the crust. When you lift up one side, slides to the other because the water was there, came to a crashing halt on the Pacific, the rising Pacific Ridge, and in doing so, created our Olympic mountain ranges according to the theory. So, Dr. Brown, we're always deceived by looking at a map of the ocean floor and the Earth, because when you take a globe and you try and lay it out two-dimensionally, it puts everything into distortion, as you probably learned in school. What Walt Brown did is he took the map of the ocean floor, made it accurate to a globe, and then he made the North and South American continent, including their continental shelves, and the European and African continental shelves, and made it accurate to the shape of the globe, and this is what you end up with when you bring them up to the crack. Doesn't that look like a nice fit? The evolutionists have a different take on it, but it really doesn't make sense. But what does the ridge on the ocean floor have to do with the crack in the crust? How could the 46,000 mile ridge form? Again, as we've mentioned before, this is the crust here pushing down on the basaltic mantle area with a subterranean chamber. Everything is balanced because the crust is pushing down evenly all over the Earth, putting 62,000 pounds per square inch. If it was 10 miles thick, it was about 62,000 pounds per square inch all over the mantle. And you have to understand that rock doesn't seem like it's a very good spring, that it doesn't have any springiness to it. But everything, when it's under 62,000 pounds, it can be springy. So the mantle's being pressed, and so the mantle is under such intense pressure that if you could remove that pressure, it would act like a spring and want to come out wherever you can remove the pressure. So everybody follow that, I hope, because there's some geologists that work for AIG that don't understand that and say that the mantle can't become a spring. Everything acts like a spring. It might not move very far with a piece of pressure, but when you put 60,000 pounds, it'll become a spring. So, at the end of 150 days, this is a situation. That crack has eroded into a V shape, and these crustal pieces are pushing down on the mantle with much greater pressure than the water is pushing down on the mantle. And you have to think these crustal pieces on each side, in the case of North America, which is currently 3,000 miles wide, before it moved west and crashed and buckled up with mountain ranges, let's say, and I'm not saying this is what it was, but let's say it was 5,000 miles wide. So you have a 5,000 mile wide continent pressing down on the mantle. And you have this crack, which Dr. Brown estimates was about 800 miles wide. So the crushing of the crust down on the mantle is like a hand on a tube of toothpaste. And it's pushing. And the blue here in this diagram, this V area, is like the screwed off cap of the nozzle of the toothpaste tube. And so the crust is squishing and the toothpaste is getting ready to come out, which is the mantle. The mantle is the toothpaste, the hand is the crust, and it's wanting to come out through that hole. And it's represented by bricks. If you put a spring underneath a brick, and you widen the bricks away from the spring, ultimately it will pop up like that. Hopefully everybody could figure that out. And then the detractors of Dr. Brown, even a geologist from Answering Judge says, it's not a spring. Yes, it is a spring. The mantle wants to do that. It's a simple physics fact, which was demonstrated when they were doing mining this limestone quarry in Yorkshire, England in 1887. They kept digging deeper and deeper and deeper, and pretty soon they're starting to cut the bottom of the floor of the quarry, and the bottom of the floor starts exploding up into the workers' faces, because the wall was so heavy compared to the floor that the shale was wanting to get out from underneath the wall and go to the low pressure area. And so then the low pressure area was bowing up the quarry floor, and they couldn't quarry down anymore because the limestone was exploding as they were trying to go down any further. The detractors will say, but Walt, the wall is going down. You're saying America lifted up and started moving west, but the wall is going down. Well, that's where you lose it in the analogy here. If you had that wall going for another 5,000 miles out, and you had the pushing, somewhere where your hand is pushing on the toothpaste tube, you're making an indentation, you're making a lower area. And on the Earth, that lower area was on the Pacific side. And so you're squishing the mantle's popping up and lifting up one side of the continent as the continent moves up. The next is the physics behind these forces are demonstrated also by, and Walt has I've seen him in a seminar that he gave. This is a mattress. The white is like a mattress that's pressed into this box to give it a springiness, to demonstrate the springiness of the mantle. These are like little, on top of here, these are like little slabs of heavy wood, and if you lay them all on the mattress, it goes flat, and it looks flat. And then what he demonstrates is he pulls off the center piece of wood, nothing happens. Pulls off one on each side of the center, nothing happens. Pull off another one on each side, boom, it just pops up in the exact shape of this 46,000-mile mid-oceanic ridge. But you'll notice that there's a problem here with this demonstration too. That's a void space. Now the mantle can't pop up with a void space. Something has to fill that space. And the place that it was filled up from was the other side of the Earth. It was from the Pacific side that was providing the mantle, pushing down on the mantle to provide the uplifting of the mid-oceanic ridge. There's one place that's the center. If you look at the center of the ocean trenches of the Earth, the trenches are in the Pacific. The exact center of the trench area is exactly on the opposite side of where the Atlantic ridge would have started to rise. When the ridge first started coming up, material has to come from inside the Earth someplace to allow that ridge to go up. And without getting too technical here, it had to come from someplace, and material started to move in the Earth. By the way, when we're talking 4,000-mile radius of the Earth, from the center of the Earth out to us is 4,000 miles. We're talking almost the skin of an apple is the crustal area. But something has to move into that place. You can't have the void space. And because of the way the Earth was, and possibly the crust was a little bit thicker in the Pacific, it provided the extra push to push down the mantle to create it to come up over in the Atlantic to then cause these continents to move towards the Pacific. Does that help? Inner Earth material would have been moving towards the rising Atlantic. There are trenches because the crustal piece in the Pacific would have been bowing down as the Atlantic was rising, and there are thousands and thousands of volcanoes on the floor in the Pacific, and Dr. Brown theorizes this is how the very hot inner outer core, they call it the outer core, the very center of the Earth they know is solid, surrounded by the inner solid Earth is what's called the liquid outer core, followed by the mantle, followed by the crust. And Dr. Brown theorizes that the heat of this material moving to the rising ridges caused the viscosity, it added so much heat that actually other settling took place because of the different density materials and created a massive melting of the inner Earth, as well as creating even the magma that we see coming out on the Earth today. Also, and many people are, Walt, you must be wrong. Look at how far away Asia is from the crack in the Pacific, and so where's that crust? Well, in that area, the crust went down, and it's the ocean floor. And by the way, science has done some ocean floor investigation over in the western part of the Pacific Ocean. They dig down. They expect to find what they find in all the other oceans of the world, basaltic type material. There's crustal material, which is granite, and then there's mantle ocean floor material, which is basaltic. What they find when they dig down in the western Pacific is they find crushed granite. The lava that comes out has granite in it. And so they're amazed by that. So when it lifted in the Atlantic, and by the way, see it's labeled flank rifts, axial rifts, and then there were fracture zones, because if you take rock and all of a sudden it bows up and goes into tension, it's going to create ridges. It's going to break and pop those cracks on the top. Those features are for the entire 46,000-mile length of the ridge. It proves that it came up in tension. And then it would have been a zipper. The first place it came up, it would have zipped from both sides, and it would have also been, as it was rolling up this way, it would have created fracture zones perpendicular to the axis. And that's what you see on the entire length of the mid-oceanic ridge. And this is all happening underwater at first, and the continents start taking a ride. Dr. Brown theorizes that they got up to the speed of 45 miles an hour. And again, Dr. Brown, he's an MIT mechanical engineer, doctorate, just using some basic assumptions. If you put mass in motion, what's going to happen? Well, when we watch train wrecks on TV and you sit there and go, wow, those heavy trains piling into a wall. Wow, that's a lot of energy, a lot of damage. Imagine the trillions of tons involved with a 10-plus mile thick continent heading west, going 45 miles an hour. When it runs out of its lubrication, or it runs into something, there's going to be some major changes that occur to those crusts. So the ridge grew. North and South America started moving towards the west. Europe and Africa to the east, both were lubricated with the remaining water, and off they went. As these forces of momentum are building up, the continents are coming crashing, running out of lubrication. South America, if you look here, the Andes mountain range, which goes right along with the leading edge of the movement, the Andes mountain range, probably ran out of lubrication, ran out of water, is crushing down along on the mantle, and boom, starts lifting up and folding on itself. America ran into the Pacific Ridge, creating the Olympic Cascade Mountain Range from north to south, the Rocky Mountains, or a few cars back in the big train wreck, the Rocky Mountains bow up. A few more train cars back, the Appalachian Mountains bow up. And everything's coming to crash, and everything is moving towards the Pacific. Now, look at that. This is a mountain range in Canada. I think every Christian student should take this picture to their geology class, their evolutionary geology class, because this one picture destroys evolutionary layer theory to smithereens. Because layers do not lay down like that in folded layers. In other words, this picture really looks obvious that at one time those layers were horizontal, and while they were still soft, because this is solid rock now, while they were still soft, somebody took them and crunched them together and folded them. And this is not made up, that's real. Well, what in the world could fold soft before solidifying what is now sedimentary rock? There is no answer except the hydroplate theory. Everything has just been freshly laid down. It's underwater. The carbon associated with the carbon dioxide coming out of the fountains of the Great Deep had not been the cementing agent of this sedimentary rock yet. It was still not solidified, just like it takes a while for concrete to dry through the same cementing process. And so these layers have been laid down, they're soft. They're riding on top of the average thickness of sediments on the earth at the time was, now today is a mile thick, sitting on top of North American continent. North America goes for a ride to the west, comes to a crashing halt. The momentum, with all those layers laid down horizontally, the momentum says, I'm still going. Boom, 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 folds it up. Does everybody follow that? To demonstrate this, this is our sedimentary hydroplate. This is North America. And this guy down here is the mantle that it's going running on. And now I can lift this up pretty high, and it doesn't want to, that high. It doesn't want to take a ride because of the friction that's there. Now, evolutionary scientists say that all the mountain ranges were by the slow subduction process, the mantle going down, inches a year, pushing. Well, see, if I were to try, that's like saying I can push this sedimentary rock with a straw. Can I push this with a straw? No, the straw would crush. Within 10 miles into land, anything that's pushing on granite crust, 10 miles in, you cannot transfer that force because you'd be crushing it. There's too much friction of the crust sitting down on top of the mantle. Does everybody kind of follow that? You can't move something without that something being strong enough. But if North America was lubricated with water underneath and the mantle popped up, it's going for a ride because there's no friction. The water's keeping the friction until it runs out of water or runs into something. This is now the earth flooded with water, and the ground is just barely flooded. You have to remember that the Bible says that all the land was flooded at 22 and a half feet. The highest piece of land was 22 and a half feet underwater. So when the crust started moving, if this crushes, then that means that I have more of a place for water to go into because the land is going to crush up and the water is going to have room to go into and the water level will go down. Does everybody follow that? And so then the dry land appears. As the continent, which was, let's say, 5,000, I don't know that was accurate, when North America comes to a crushing halt, thickening the crust, creating mountain ranges, flipping over pieces of crust and sedimentary layers, which we see all over the place. Uplift, vertically uplift, huge sedimentary layers that were laid down horizontal, like in my hometown of Colorado, west of Denver, there's a place called Red Rocks. Huge sedimentary layers lifted up, crushed. And we can't use water in here. Now what we're going to do is and what we're going to do is have the water go in here. We're going to show that it's all flooded, drain it into a bucket, and then lift the bucket up, have the water lubricated, and find out that you don't have to lift it very high at all before it to take a ride. So pretend I'm not lifting it very high, but then we go up like this. And if we had been flooded before when we put the water in, our shoreline's here, and here's the Olympic Cascade Mountain Range. And I have crust that's above water. Does everybody follow that? So in the question of where did all the water go? Well, all the water ran off into the widening ocean basins because the continents were crushing like this. You had a 10-mile deep. For every mile that crust narrowed, because it's building up into mountains, that's a 1 mile thick, 10-mile deep area for water to run off into. What does the Bible say? God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. I know some people that went over to watch the Kingdom and, be destroyed. Anybody here go to the Kingdom? Oh yeah, you were there, Lauren, and others. There was a huge, for those that were there, it was like, wow. As that kingdom went down, it just sent debris everywhere. Why? Because all of a sudden you have huge solid thing displacing a bunch of air. And it created a huge wind that threw that debris all over downtown Seattle. Imagine hundreds of thousands of square miles of land coming up out of the water. And as that land's coming up out of the water, it's displacing air. The foundations of the deep and the windows of the heaven were also stopped. And the rain from heaven was restrained. Because as soon as it did that, now the earth is again sitting down in the mantle. There's not much water left underneath the earth, but there is water. Walt Brown has theorized that there is still water underneath all the mountain ranges of the earth. They've done a recent discovery underneath the Himalayan mountain range that they said that by their conductivity measurements, there must be brackish aqueous solution underneath the Himalayan mountain range. There is a deficiency of gravity underneath every mountain range. Why? Because water weighs less than rock. And they're shocked because they can measure gravity, which is based on mass, and if they assume that the height of the mountain is rock mountain all the way down to the center of the earth, there should be the same density and the gravity associated with that density. But they find out that there's not as much because there's water underneath the mountain ranges. And so there's a gravity deficiency. And the waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. And Job says, the book of Job says, or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? Was the door that shut when the crust came to a stop and the tips of where the water had been coming out at the tips of the crack sat down in the mantle as the mantle popped up, shutting the doors, not letting any more of the subterranean water out? When I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors, when I said, this far you may come, but no further, and here your proud waves must stop. Psalm 104 says, verse 5, you who laid the foundations of the earth, so that it should not be moved forever, you covered it, the earth, with the deep, as with a garment the waters stood above the mountains. The flood occurred. God's saying, hey, the flood occurred, the psalmist is saying, the flood occurred, and at your rebuke, they, the waters, fled. At your voice of your thunder, they hastened away. They went up and over the mountains. Now the psalmist is saying, you flooded the earth. At your rebuke, the water started going up and over the mountains. Well, now water doesn't go up and over mountains unless it's doing so because the mountains are crushing and water is running off of this continent, and it would have gone up, off of the highest mountain, like the Rocky Mountains, heading west, and it would have been washing all the way over to the west coast, all the way over to the east coast, rapidly running off of the continent. And any broken pieces of crust or other items would have been going for a ride, a rock tumbling effect as they're running off of the rising continent. They went up and over the mountains. They went down into the valleys to the place which you founded for them. They went down into the valleys in the place you founded for them. You have set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. These are solid chunks of granite, crustal granite, that have been rock tumbled sitting, and I think this is in Australia. These things are found all over the earth. In fact, if you go down on Interstate 15 down from Marietta down to San Diego, you'll see on the sides these massive granite boulders that are rounded off on the side of the road. When I drive down that road, I go, thank you, Jesus. I know how those granite boulders got there. They got there, they probably came from Colorado and just up and over the mountains and just came crashing down and rock tumbling as they went. How do you explain that at 13,000 feet in the Andes Mountains in Peru, that there are petrified giant oysters? Some would say aliens dropped them there. And there's other pictures. You can do giant oysters, Andes Mountains, see other pictures on a web search. How did they get there? This was an area that did not receive, for whatever reason, did not get some of the sediment that was coming, or it washed off. At the recently laid sediments of the earth washed off as the crust of the Andes, as the Andes Mountains was coming up, as South America was crushing to the west, these giant oysters that were sitting on the bottom, they grew to 13,000 feet and then are sitting there for us to find. And another example that can be found, the sedimentary layers in the area of the Grand Canyon. They've studied the Grand Canyon probably more than any other canyon in the world, and there's partially uplifted, formerly horizontal layers. And this one is a quartzite layer. This guy right here is a quartzite layer, and it's partially uplifted. These layers stayed horizontal, but they went for a ride. When the train stopped, the horizontal layers went for a ride, but some of it uplifted. And that caused that quartzite, that's a quartzite rock embedded in those horizontal layers. Looking again, how did that block of quartzite, how did this block of quartzite that was in that previous layer, how did it come from this layer and then be displaced to the side of it? Easy to explain with the hydroplate theory, very difficult for others. Okay, and this is George Hess's animation, and let it roll. And that's why we're living in a very seismic area. When we crashed up and over the Pacific Ridge, there's imbalances that are still there. There's trapped water underneath our mountains. There's trapped magma underneath our mountains. And we're in an extremely seismic area. Why is it, and people wonder, why is it that they call this area the Ring of Fire? And I've been watching earthquakes on a daily basis. This is from the USGS earthquake site. I've been watching and plotting actually on a database the number of global earthquakes just to keep an eye on it. And the size of these squares are the magnitude of the quakes. The color of the squares is how soon they've been, whether one within the last hour, within the last day, or within the last week. But always you see this number of earthquakes or greater that are concentrated here. Why? Because everything, according to Walt Brown's theory, everything came crashing there. And that's where there's still instabilities of this earth. This earth is still trying to get round. It's trying to get rid of all the imbalances associated with these crustal changes that occurred a few thousand years ago. As soon as everything crashes up, it's sitting on top of the mantle and it wants to sink in the mantle. But the mantle is putty, it's not water. So it can't sink immediately. And so over the years, it's been sinking down, and we know, people wonder, how did animals get from this island? How did the Galapagos Island finches get stranded there? How did animals get from one continent to another? Because they were all connected. This is immediately after the flood. This is probably what the earth looked like. And because there's shallow areas and everything you can tell is connected, it would have been easy for people and animals to get from one place to the other. Over the years, the mantle, the mountains sank down into the mantle, causing this effect to occur as you watch. And again, this is based on actual areas of the Earth that are relatively shallow. We can't appreciate it because we just see ocean. You don't see the shallow areas. And so now we're in this condition where, we're separated by a large amount of ocean waters, and so that also would have occurred had this been the way we got to where we are today. As the waters ran off, any place that would have been this huge basin with earthen dams would have created a huge lake. As the waters ran off, if there was a dam, it would create a huge lake. Dr. Brown spent a year in the area of the Grand Canyon. He found evidence going through the deserts of Utah, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. He saw evidence of water all at the same elevation everywhere along there. And then theorized, at one time there used to be a lake, and he named it Grand Lake, and now this is very popularized by other Christian organizations, but they never say that Walt Brown did the research, and it's for reasons I am baffled by. But then if this dam broke right here, what would you have created? You would have created that. And not by that little old Colorado River running for millions and millions of years through all these layers. You would have had one mother of a flood as the dam broke and the billions of gallons of water washed from the Grand Lake through this gorge of freshly laid down sedimentary rock, creating the Grand Canyon. There's a law of physics that any spinning sphere wants to spin where the greatest mass is at the equator. So when this crustal change was happening on the Earth, all of a sudden it was spinning before the flood. It was spinning in an orientation that had the greatest mass at the center of the Earth, or at the equator. Because the crust went on a big ride, then the upheaving mountain ranges, every mountain range that popped up is now wanting to get to the equator. So the mountain ranges in the southern hemisphere, they're wanting to move the Earth up north. The mountain ranges in the northern hemisphere, they want to move the Earth south. And they're competing for each other, but the most massive mountain range on the Earth is the Himalaya mountain range. And so it was the predominant force wanting to roll the Earth from the north, where the Himalaya mountain range was much closer up to the North Pole when this crushing effect happened. That mountain range wants to move down south, wants to roll the Earth. So that means that here's now, because of the equator of this shotgun shot, that white dot is where this ball wants to be, the North Pole. So I can spin this ball in any orientation, and this ball will want to make that white dot the North Pole. Now it still spins with the axis in the exact same place, but the ball is actually rolling on the ice, and it's going to ultimately roll to the point where that white dot is again the North Pole. Either that or, physics is changing. And it's just a simple fact. Now, what can throw this off is, again, the unbalance effect, which it's wobbling because we didn't perfectly counterbalance what he was doing. But the Earth wants to do this too, by the way. It wants to wobble because of our imbalances. It ultimately gets down to the point where all those forces work together, and we will see that that thing goes to the North Pole. And while it's doing that, I wanted to also say, as the Earth has bulged because of the centrifugal force, people on the equator are traveling 1,000 miles an hour. And there's a centrifugal force associated with that, because it's 24,000 miles circumference, goes once in 24 hours, so it's 1,000 miles an hour. So if the Earth is going to roll as a result of what we've been talking about and the crustal changes, if it's going to roll, then the bulge, just like this, it's rolling. Well, the bulge doesn't want to be where it was. The bulge wants to be at the new equator. But the Earth doesn't want that bulge to go to someplace else because something's going to have to rip to make it happen. Does everybody see that? The bulge is going to have to do something to the Earth to grow to that new place. And Dr. Brown theorizes that 90 East Ridge is where, when the Earth rolled, that 90 East Ridge is the scar on this planet of where that bulge grew from where it was to where it is today. Because it had to rip the Earth to get to where it is today. Now, I knew this before the Sumatra quake. Saturday night when the Sumatra quake happened at the end of 2004, it was a Saturday night, I remember, because the last thing I did after getting ready for the Sunday service is I checked my earthquake map, and I go, whoa, there was a major earthquake, which in all the years I'd been watching earthquakes had never happened at the very northern tip of the 90 East Ridge. And I even wrote a letter to Walt Brown saying, Walt, look, the north end of the 90 East Ridge just had a massive earthquake. Why did that earthquake happen? Because the earth rolled and it's wanting to stretch and make that bulge, but when it stopped doing its roll, there would have been stresses built up, where it wants to rip a little bit further, but it doesn't have the force to. Over the years, all the earthquakes and everything else that's happening apparently caused that ridge to just boom, and it ripped. Does this explain why the earthquake caused a 700-mile-long uplifting of the ocean floor?
December 2004. Their combined expertise has successfully pieced together the evidence from the bottom of the ocean. They've ruled out giant underwater landslides, and in a scientific first, observed uplift on the ocean floor of almost 40 feet.
This has changed everybody. I had no idea that we would actually see these really big displacements in the ditch. I thought we might see some faulting and maybe some rubble, but I had no idea that we'd see these big displacements. So it was fabulous. We measured ranges of displacement, sometimes 3 meters to 12 at one point. And we know that this displacement happened in many locations all along the margin. And it started further south, and then like a zipper, it just opened up all the way up the northern coast.
It's a discovery that has changed our understanding of the creation of these giant waves.
Anyway, as soon as I saw that, even there's guys here today that on the Sunday, when we heard about the tsunami, I told the guys, it's probably uplifted on the ocean floor. We heard that there was they were thinking it was a landslide. Nope, it's not going to be a landslide. And they have footage of where it vertically lifted 700 miles along the side. Huge tsunami occurred as a result of it. They think it's going to happen off of the west coast. It's not going to, because the 90 East Ridge was formed from a different phenomena. And there's one other video that let's watch. That there's still liquid magma underneath our crust. So when the Denali earthquake happened in Alaska, that we had a micro earthquake in Lake Union. Lake Union shook. And this is footage from November 2002, Como TV.
And it was just going kabam, kabam, kabam.
That's one of the eyewitness accounts on Lake Union, where houseboats suddenly rocked so violently that water and sewage lines snapped in two.
So the whole thing shifted, actually at quite a bit of distance.
Floating homes were rocking differently than any of these homeowners ever witnessed before.
Not this up and down
Right,
you would get
usually
if a
you go
boat
like
came
this.
through here. And so we just didn't, it was very disorienting. And then we realized that it was the water going this way.
And seismologists say they could blame the Alaska quake. While it didn't generate a tsunami, energy waves traveling through water could indeed slosh Lake Union.
You do get this very low frequency motion, very slow up and down, and that can cause bodies of water to sort of slosh, a little bit like in a bathtub.
Seismologists say there are similar reports from Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans and from nuclear power plants as far away as Minnesota, where tonight they're asking the same questions heard on Lake Union.
And then looked out to say, what is happening here?
Okay, now the seismologist said that by the earthquake waves, that it could slosh Lake Union, thousands of miles away. Okay, it didn't slosh any of the lakes between Denali and Lake Union, just Lake Union. And just Lake Pontchartrain, where it snapped 1-inch mooring lines on huge lots in Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana. It changed the intensity and the frequency of geysers in Yellowstone National Park. Now, how could that happen? Again, if there was still trapped water and liquid magma of the crust coming to a crashing halt at the end of what Dr. Brown calls the compression event, there would have been liquid magma and water trapped underneath our crust. You have this huge Denali earthquake, and what was it, 7.9, 8 pointer, 7.9. It's like pressing down your brake pedal on your car, bang, on a hydraulic system. Now you press your brake pedal down, and what happens? The weak spots in your hydraulic system, your slave cylinders on your brakes, they move, and they put your brakes on. And so what does that mean? Lake Union is a bad place to live. Because there is liquid, and they pressed down in Alaska, and the hydraulic effect went underneath the continent, and it found a couple of significant weak places, Louisiana and Lake Union, and punched just those. And so that means in a more severe earthquake, you would have the trapped pressure underneath the crust. If it breaks the crust above or in the area of Lake Union, you would have this tremendous disaster that would occur if you could actually break this area, Lake Pontchartrain or Yellowstone, pop the magma underneath Yellowstone. So looking at a map, you see that the Denali earthquake, and there's the scientists investigated the timing of it. Yachts in New Orleans, Lake Pontchartrain, snapped light. We had a guest here that lived in Lake Pontchartrain at the time. He says the lake just looked like a bathtub that you just shook up. It says, one scientist commented, every time we drill a hole, we find the unexpected. That's exciting but disturbing. And a science reporter remarked, the COLA, a deep drilling project, revealed how far from true scientific theory, evolution scientific theory, can roam. And they're shocked by what they find. It totally supports Dr. Brown's theory of how we got to where we are. Genesis 8 and 4, if you read the rest, we're going to have to just cover these as a review next week of these chapters, verses out of Genesis. But let's do one closing verse and going to Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 24, and then we'll close. And it says in verse 19, the earth is violently broken. The earth is split open. The earth is shaken exceedingly. The earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and shall totter like a hut. Its transgression shall be heavy upon it, and it shall fall and not rise again. It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will punish on high the host of exalted ones. The host of the exalted ones is Satan. God will punish Satan and destroy him. But the earth is headed for another cataclysm. There's judgment by fire, as we mentioned from the book of Peter. The unleashing of forces still underneath our crust are going to cause the earth to reel again. And the earth is going to wobble a lot more, according to the scriptures, because of these kind of energies that are placed still underneath the crust.